Well, this is walking through Mark 26, and the location will be chapter 13. That's real easy to remember. Half of 26 is 13. I'm not trying to keep it half, it just ends up being that way, I guess. And so, Mark chapter 13, we will begin reading there in just a moment. And it's episode or installment of the series number 26. While you're finding the place, if you want to read along, that is, I might just set it up a little by saying we are now within just 48 hours or 2 or 3 days. I'm not trying to be too precise here, but we are definitely coming right up to the cross of Jesus. And he, over the last couple days, has been I guess you can call it a routine of going into the city of Jerusalem during the day, but retiring to a neighboring village, Bethany, Bethphage, some nearby town within easy walking distance, at night. And one of the things that will transpire later, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, is that he will need to go into the city at night for the Passover, and that's where the Lord's Supper is instituted after supper, after the Passover, and that's in Jerusalem at night, uncharacteristic of what he's been doing over the last few days, which is daily in the temple. And he even says that, by the way, on one occasion. He says, daily I was with you in the temple. And they wouldn't lay a hand on him then. They were fearful of the people. And at night, well, he's not there. They don't know where he's at. And once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Judas will help him out there, and you know that story probably, but that's still to come. Okay, enough said, I guess. Let's get right to it. Mark chapter 13, verse 1. Then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answered and said to him, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew asked him privately, Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled? And Jesus, answering them, began to say, Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I'm he, and will deceive many. But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows. But watch out for yourselves, for they will deliver you up to councils, and you will be beaten in the synagogues. You will be brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak. But whatever is given you in that hour, speak that, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Now brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. He continues speaking there. Verse 14 is where we will resume in just a moment. But since it's such a large reading there, let me divide it at least in two parts. Just go back quickly with a brief commentary as I go along. He as he's departing, he hears an observation just how gorgeous, and we do that too, by the way. It's not unheard of to make comment about just how beautiful certain structures are, temple in this case, or the other buildings connected with it. We do that still. We'll talk about a lovely building or a lovely house and that kind of thing. He uses it though as an occasion to make a stark statement of disaster. Yes, it's true, they are beautiful. But then he drops, pardon the expression, a bombshell. It's almost like a bombshell because it's going to be a big time destruction. He says, let me tell you something. It's coming soon that this temple, these buildings you're admiring will not be, I mean, they're not just going to be somehow damaged a bit. They're going to be utterly destroyed. I mean, they're going to be obliterated. I mean, stones are not left standing on top of each other, and these are some huge stones. I'm told or have heard about. So these are not little bricks like we use. I mean, these are huge stones. This is one big time destruction. Well, of course, that triggers in well, there's four mentioned. Peter, James, John, and Andrew. This time is added to that inner circle of three that we've often referenced, asking privately, when's this going to happen? And he then begins to reveal some things to them before it's going to happen. When is this temple here that we've just been complimenting or commenting about so favorably, so beautifully, going to be obliterated? Now, I don't know if they knew by implication what that meant, but I'm going to suggest possibly. For the temple to be destroyed like that, before the age of the military type capabilities of today, with not only nuclear weapons, but just your standard kind of bombardment from artillery and bombings of all kinds of things from outside and from within, they knew, of course, that Jerusalem is not going to go down without a fight. I mean, it's not going to be just somehow some guy snuck in and blew up the temple like it might happen today. This is going to be at the end of, or at the result of somebody from without penetrating an opposing force who wants the temple destroyed, first through the wall and then generally the people and so forth. Now, I don't know how much they put two and two together to know that, but for the destruction of the temple to this degree, I'm looking back on it easily through Scripture to see that had to be one big time destruction before that happens. A little bit more on that in just a minute. And so one of the first things he says is, don't be led off. The things that will happen in connection with this coming about will cause some to be deceived and misled. People claiming to be the Lord come back, the Savior. Jesus is here. Don't be deceived. There'll be all kinds of calamity that you'll hear about in the world, nations fighting, and everybody's going to be tempted to think, well, okay, this must be it. Okay, this is about to happen. And he says, I'm telling you, there'll be a lot of that kind of thing going on, troubles before. That's just the start of it. When you hear of all that kind of thing, that's not the end. That's the beginning of the end. And then he does talk about how inwardly, within the Jewish population, within Jerusalem and so forth, there would be just terrible things happening of betrayal, people desperate for survival, people turning in their own relatives, just some very, very hateful things going on. And but you got to endure. Now that's the last thing he said there. I mean, he's still talking when we resume reading, but I mean, the last thing I read that he said is, you're going to need to endure, though, all of this for you to be saved. Okay? And I don't think he means save your soul by being baptized into Christ. He's talking about salvation from that disaster that he's been talking about. Okay, back to the reading 14. So when you see the abomination of desolation, more on that later, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. More on that later too. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who's on the housetop not go down into the house, nor enter to take anything out of the house. And let him who's in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter. For in those days there will be tribulation such as has not been since the beginning of the creation which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. Then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, here he is, he is there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. But take heed. See, I've told you all this. I've told you all things beforehand. Okay, I mentioned as I was reading that I'd come back to a couple of things. First of all, he knows that they know. These are Jewish people. These are not Gentiles who are not familiar with the Bible text, the Old Testament scriptures and such like. He says, Daniel has talked about what I'm saying now. The abomination of desolation, Daniel has spoken of. You can read about it, I believe, in chapter 11 and 12. I'm looking at my reference notes here. And Mark, who's writing this, that Jesus said, parenthetically, at least in English Bibles, it's parenthetically, inserts his comment there. He says, let the reader understand. I don't think that's Jesus talking there. Maybe it is, but I think it's probably Mark saying, let the reader grasp what he's getting at here by reading what Daniel said and such like. One comment more on that, and then I'll move on, and that is that there was something detestable. Abomination is something disgusting and detestable, and just we might say extremely. I'll go back to the original word, abominable. And if you see it, and it's in connection with some kind of desolation taking place, and he's talking about a desolation here. He's talking about the destruction of the temple. And in those days, that kind of awful destruction and temple destruction would not be like today, just dropping a bomb on the building. This is one huge, I'll stay with the word, desolation. And he had indicated something abominable will be taking place in connection with it. And Mark, who writes it, and Jesus even talks about it, says, when you see it standing where it ought not to be, then you need to get out of Judea. You need to flee, go to the mountains, get out of town is what we'd say. All right. So I'm not going to try to explain it all as much as to say that that was to make sense to them. That was to be something that not only they, but Mark, who wrote it years later, 20, 30 years later, that the people who were reading it, I'll just pick a number, in the year 60 or 65 AD, they could say, oh, I get it. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'll be on the lookout for that, that kind of thing. Now, I could speculate, and I'm not saying it would be totally speculation with no grounds for saying so, but I'm just saying we can speculate as to what it was, standing where it ought not, that would be a sign, if you will, oh, that ought not to be there, and you need to get out. And now I could go into that, but I'll pass. So then he indicates now is the time to go. Previously, it said you need to endure to the end and not be led astray early by a lot of disastrous things happening. But eventually, when you see this, and this taking place, go, run, get out of town. And I mean get out of town fast. He talks about if you're out there in the field, don't go back in to get clothes. If you're on the housetop, just jump down and run. If you're basically, you immediately, and I mean immediately, not in the next day or two, immediately you're to go for the mountains. Now, a lot of people who didn't believe in Jesus and his words would stay in the city because they think that's where to be protected. But he's telling just the opposite. You need to get out of here. The destruction that's about to happen here, your salvation will be through not being here, but going. And I'm sorry if you're pregnant. That's going to be rough. And if you're nursing babies, because you got to be out there and you're not going on a camping trip with all kinds of preparation made either. You're just going with basically the shirts on your back and whatever, maybe if you could grab something to eat, but you're going to be out there for a while. And if you're pregnant, oh my, and you better hope and pray it's not in the wintertime. I mean, it can get pretty cold. And in the mountains, it might even be snow. And shoo, I sure hope it's not, 30 degrees out there. And you haven't brought adequate provisions for sheltering from the weather. Not here, but in one of the other gospel accounts, he also says, Jesus says in connection with this, pray it's not on the Sabbath day. So he gets right down to, the actual day of the week. You better hope and pray, ask God that it not be on Saturday. Some have wondered, why does that make a difference? And it could be, someone said, I'll just take their word for it, that it would be hard to get out of town if the gates were closed on the Sabbath. Makes sense to me. I don't know if that's the case, but if that's the case, either way, I know one thing that's not just a guess, and that is you better hope and pray it's not on the Sabbath day. And it's going to last a while. This is not 2 days or 2 weeks. I don't know exactly how long it will be, but it's going to be a long time. And if God doesn't intervene himself to make it come short or shut down quicker than might be, I tell you what, everybody, even those maybe out in the mountains, would perish because of how long it is out there. I don't know. I do know that he says God is going to shorten it, and for your sake, for the elect's sake. And one more thing, and once again, he keeps inserting this idea, and don't be deceived by people saying, Christ is here, I'm here to save you. Don't go for it. It's not me. And one more short part of reading here, and then we'll stop. I see my time is about where I normally like to stop for these videos, but we're right in the middle of something. Give me a couple more minutes. But in those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will fall, and powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he shall send, or he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of earth to the farthest part of heaven. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer's near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near, at the doors. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. There is more actually to the story, and I'm going to need to save it for next time. Well, let me just go ahead and introduce it. The next thing he says is, but I can't get real precise as to the actual day and hour. Only God the Father has revealed that, or knows that, and has not revealed that. This is as close as I can get for you, because it's God's will in heaven, not to, through me to you on earth, tell you any more precisely when it's going to be than that. Okay, historically, and this is not needing to rely on the Bible because history records it, the destruction of Jerusalem took place about 70 A.D., and I remember seeing even an Ark of Titus in Rome when I was just a youngster. My dad and family were there, and they have a relief, or engraving in this arch, the General Titus conquering of Jerusalem and so forth, if I recall correctly. And I was just a child, so I may not remember it all just right, but history says that that's when it took place. So it was about 40 years later, give or take, depending on how calendars have accurately been reckoned. It's generally about 40 years later. And he says here, I'm just letting you know, this generation's, we're not talking 200 or 300 years from now. He says, this generation standing right here, listening to me talk about this, is not going to pass before it happens. And it did. It happened within that generation's time. Now, some of the language seems to point towards something at the end of time, and not necessarily is that the case, unless there's a dual application, maybe. Many people have debated that point, but when he talks about the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light and stars of heaven falling and so forth, a lot of that can be, it may not be, but it can be figuratively, in connection with the topic of consideration, which is the destruction of Jerusalem and you might also say by extension Israel and the Jewish people, their own capital, be like Washington, D.C. being destroyed. I mean, it's going to be turmoil for quite a while with that kind of destruction that takes place. And even to this day, 21 centuries later, we still talk about people, Hollywood stars, and that kind of thing. Stars and moon and sun and so forth can be figures of speech, is what I'm saying, that they would be falling. Jesus would come back again, and some have argued, did he come back visibly or not? But either way, I know he came in connection with that judgment upon the Jewish people at that time. Okay, I'll close and indicate that he says, bank on this, people. Heaven and earth will pass away, but not me and my words, me and my words. And if I've said it's this way, it's going to be this way. And you need to, how to see signs and read signs. You see leaves and hey, it's almost time for, a branch to come forth with leaves and so forth. That was in verse number 28, I believe. And so you need to take these signs, these advanced warnings that I'm giving you as a help to you, and save yourself if you're alive at that time to deal with it, or hearing Mark recorded, and they're reading it in 65 AD, which is just before it happened. So anyway, I'll stop there.